The Trojan War. Today we are up to chapter 4, the discovery of Achilles. When Agamemnon had won over Odysseus, his task with the other kings was far easier. With Odysseus' example and persuasion, they gradually assembled until every king had arrived but one, the greatest hero of all. This was Achilles, only son of Peleus and Thetis, by this time grown to manhood and now famous for his strength, his speed of foot, and his beauty. Peleus was too old to lead the powerful array of the Myrmidons, but in Achilles could be found a successor. All had heard of Achilles' feats, for he had been brought up by the centaur, Chiron, half horse, half man, who had been tutor to many heroes. Achilles, it was said, could outrace the deer and catch the flying dart that his own hand had flung. He could check a maddened team of horses in full flight and face a lion or a mad she-bear alone. All knew of his goddess mother and of the tale that her son would be more famous far than his father, the mighty Peleus. Unfortunately, there was another prophecy about Achilles, which silver-footed Thetis had learned from her father, an old, wise sea god. Though her son was to be very famous, his life was to be short. He would die in the height of his glory before the gates of Troy. Thetis was desperately anxious to cheat the fates. When her son was a baby, she had taken him down to the gray mud banks of the Styx, which flowed round the land of the dead. She had plunged him into the seething waters that even the ghosts dared not enter, and thereby she had made his flesh immune from death. No weapon could kill him. One heel only was unprotected, where the goddess had gripped her baby as she dipped him in. Not content with this, Thetis had gone further and tried to make him immortal. Here, she was prevented by Peleus, who did not understand what she was doing and feared for the baby's life. Thetis left her husband in anger at this and went back to the dim depths of the sea. Yet she still watched over Achilles, and to protect him from war, she sent him at last to the court of the king of Scyros to be brought up among his daughters. Here, Achilles lived in seclusion, and because of his youth and beauty, passed for a girl when he was dressed like one. In private, he might ride and run, or throw the javelin, but when he came forward among the princesses and the king said, "These are my daughters," no one could distinguish Achilles, though all knew that one of them was he. The messenger of Agamemnon had been sent to summon Achilles, but the king said, "I have only daughters." And closely as the messenger looked, he could not tell to which one he should appeal. They all blushed and looked astonished. Achilles, who was secretly wedded to one of the princesses, Diademia, probably said that wrong. And I did just tell you guys about the pronunciation guide in the last video. Well, I already forgot. He had given his word to his wife and mother not to reveal himself. He was therefore silent, although he himself wished to go. Finally, Agamemnon appealed to Odysseus, who thought of a trick to discover the truth. He came as a traveling merchant, not a messenger, asking to display his wares in the palace of the king. At first, he showed valuable ornaments, pins, combs, bracelets, women's wear only, and too precious for ordinary girls. Presently, therefore, a servant came to the great hall from the princesses, asking the merchant to bring his goods to the mistress's room. Attendants picked up the bales and boxes, some of them not yet unpacked, and escorted the merchant across the courtyard to where the princesses sat. Odysseus watched the girls carefully as they exclaimed over his wares. Each picked up pins and jewels, tried them on, paraded with them in gown or hair, yet it seemed to the crafty watcher that one showed less eagerness. Casually, he undid another bundle for them. In it lay more trinkets, even rarer than before, but in the midst of them lay a marvelous sword, such as a man might dream of all his life and never own. The third princess could not take her eyes off that sword. She picked up other things and played with them, but she always made excuse to put them back. Her fingers went stealthily to the blade, to the hilt, when she thought the merchant was not looking. The piles by the sides of the other two grew bigger, but the third princess had chosen nothing yet. At last the merchant feigned departure and began to close his bundles. I must go now, he said, but next year I may come again and have more treasures for you. The third princess does not like my wares, however. Is there nothing she would buy? The third princess hesitated, then decided to risk it. Yes, she said clearly, I will buy the sword. You shall have it as a gift, said the merchant, to a king's son from a king. For you must be Achilles, and I am Odysseus, come here with a message for you. Thus Odysseus delivered his message, and Achilles was glad to be discovered because he longed for the great adventure. He collected his men and set forth for Aulis, but his goddess mother wept to see him go. And now we'll read chapter 5, Iphigenia. Agamemnon lay encamped at Aulis. Black ships were drawn up too deep above the tide mark of seaweed circling the bay. Offshore, the boats of latecomers swung at anchor, their oars under the benches and their square sails carefully stowed. By countless smoky campfires, men were boiling pit oxen or burning sacrifices to. The wind blew steadily in from the sea, carrying noise of the encampment far over the uplands, whence shepherds could hear the crash of the axes, the clinking of armorers' hammers, the lowing of cattle, and the confused shouts of men. Each day brought fresh arrivals until there seemed no end to the massed forces of Greece. Chief among the heroes were Achilles and Odysseus, yet there were many others present of almost equal fame. From the horse-breeding plain of the Argos came Diomede, the charioteer. Gigantic Ajax, prince of Salamis, bore a shield of 7 layers of horsehide studded with bronze. It covered its mighty owner from head to foot, and he swung it with ease, though no other man could wield it. Let me just take a break for a second. With him was his half-brother, Teucer, the archer, who was born of a Trojan princess carried away by their father long years before. His second, Ajax, son of Oileus, was a famous spearman, and after Achilles, the swiftest runner in the host. The most respected was white-bearded Nestor of Pylos. He still led his forces in person, though he had warlike sons. These were the greatest of the chieftains, yet besides them came hundreds more. The mightiest expedition that the world had known lay ready at last, waiting only for the changing of the wind. A favorable wind was long in coming. Day after day it blew steadily in from the east. Food was unpacked and eaten. Men huddled uncomfortably in rude shelters of turf began to murmur. Some of the kings talked openly of going home. Such a storm, they said, was a sign of the gods' ill favor. The truth was they were discontented, for they found Agamemnon high-banded and haughty. Overlords are better at a distance whence they can make no claims on us, said they. Agamemnon, who heard the grumbling, realized that his host was likely to melt away. If his army went home without starving, his authority would be over. He would become the laughingstock of all Greece. While the men still held together, it was essential that the wind should change. The king sought out Calchas, the prophet, who knew the mind of the gods and could foretell the future. You must tell me how to win a fair breeze, he said. Calchas promised to find an answer, but he spent long at the altars, praying and burning offerings before he came gravely back to the king. We are indeed in the gods' ill favor. It is better that we go home, he declared. Agamemnon leaped up in indignation. That is impossible, he said as his staff rang sharply on the ground. If none of us is ever to return, we still must sail. Give me a fair wind and a hope of glory if it cost my kingdom and my life. The old man put his hand to his beard in a slow, thoughtful gesture. It will indeed cost life, he answered. The price is too high, O king. For the last time, disband us and go home. Never, cried Agamemnon hotly. Never. Do you think it is a game that I can interrupt as I please? I have staked everything on this quarrel, and if I fail now, I lose all. What treasure is too great for the gods to demand of me? Your daughter, Iphigenia, answered the prophet with his eyes on the ground. The king laughed with relief and scorn. I will offer her gladly, he declared. I had thought to marry her nobly, but the gods may make her a priestess if they will. She must be slain on the altar of Artemis, said Calchas distinctly, as the price of a fair wind. Agamemnon started in horror. His gay young daughter as a human sacrifice. Her father brought to such her father brought to consent to such a deed. No glory the world could offer would wipe away such a sin. It is impossible, he said shortly. We shall wait here. Sooner or later the wind will change. The wind did not change, and presently the other chiefs learned the dreadful news from Calchas. Plenty of them were quick to say that they had all offered their lives for a king who would not sacrifice a single one of them in the return. Although they did not wish the maiden's death, they were glad to put the blame on Agamemnon for breaking up the host. At last the king saw that he must take on himself either failure or the greatest of crimes. He was genuinely fond of his daughter, but she was less to him than his pride. He sent a messenger to bring Iphigenia to the camp. The poor girl came full of eagerness and decked out in her best clothes, for Agamemnon had given as an excuse that he had arranged a match for her with Achilles. In this, however, the king overreached himself somewhat, since his wife, Clytemnestra, insisted on attending the wedding of her child. Clytemnestra was the sister of Helen, and far prouder, though less fair. She now felt just as much rage against Agamemnon as agony at losing her child. The girl herself, stunned at first by the tidings, was at last pitifully brave. It was the furious mother who hurled at Agamemnon all the reproaches of the victim left unsaid. I will repay you for this hour if it takes me 10 years of waiting, she cried. Agamemnon turned away from her without answering. His mind was made up, and his pride thought little of a woman's threats, though he knew the fierce nature of his queen. He was perhaps more moved by the pleas of Achilles, who was touched by the young girl's courage and put aside his own hopes of glory to intercede for her. Nevertheless, the king's nature could not bear the reproach of failure, and he hardened his heart. Iphigenia was led out to the sacrifice. The knife of the slayer rose and fell. Only the gods knew that what seemed her lifeless body was really that of a fawn, since Artemis might demand but would not actually accept such an offering. The goddess snatched up Iphigenia in her arms and carried her off to the far distant land of Taurus to serve as a priestess there. The corpse lay on the altar. Men looked up from the sacrifice to see the changing of the wind. Instantly, all was confusion as each hurried down to his ship, drowning the memory of the deed they had allowed in the thoughts of glory to come. The fleet put out from Aulis, but by their crime the heroes had entered on a war that, although glorious, was to be grim. A little urn full of ashes was all that came back to many and many a home. Numbers fell fighting in a battle, and the seas drowned countless more. 10 years passed slowly. In Ithaca, Queen Penelope wept nightly for Odysseus, her lord. In the restless kingdom of the Myrmidons, the failing Peleus struggled vainly for order, longing for the help of his son. In Mycenae, grim Clytemnestra kept her husband's axe sharp and bright. Agamemnon's people looked eagerly for their king's return, and Clytemnestra waited too, that in the moment of her husband's triumph, she might murder him. End of chapter 5.